Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And first of all, I'd like to say our thoughts go out to those in the Philippines who are bearing the brunt of Typhoon Ulysses that hit the Philippines last night. Welcome to the AI for Social Good Summit today, which is a long-month regional gathering of experts and practitioners in artificial intelligence and governance, covering topics on skills and capabilities, governance, and multi-stakeholder collaboration in the AI field in Asia. As part of this month, we have a whole series of programs where we're looking not only at what it takes to create policies that avoid some of the big mistakes around the massive adoption of artificial intelligence in our countries and economies that we're seeing happening, but also help us to leverage the power of artificial intelligence to contribute to social outcomes. This summit is jointly developed by Google, UN ASCAP, and APOU in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. If you would like to go deeper into these topics, we also have the AI for Social Good report, which you can see on the screen, and which you can download from the website for this program. The report includes a series of papers by experts in AI from this region, and it's taking an in-depth look at challenges like incorporating ethics into AI and different kinds of regulatory interventions to leverage AI in contributing to societies. Now, today's session is a policy insight briefing. We have a fantastic set of AI practitioners and people involved in policymaking who will be bringing together key takeaways from our last two sessions that took place last week. So we consider today the questions of how to build and enable environment for AI in Asia countries that leverage the technology for positive social outcomes. And as part of the session today, I really would like to, and I'm very pleased to acknowledge the participation of colleagues from the Academy of Sciences in Malaysia, the Japan Science and Technology Agency, JST, and the colleagues are currently based in Singapore, the National Science and Technology Commission, NASTEC in Sri Lanka, UN ASCAP in Thailand, Ministry of Industry, Science, Technology and Innovation in Cambodia, and the Department of Science and Technology in the Philippines. Now, moderating our discussion today will be Jonathan Wong. Jonathan is Chief of Technology and Innovation at the United Nations Economy and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, one of the key partners of the AI for Social Good Summit. And before joining ASCAP, Jonathan was the head of innovation for the UK Department for International Development, DFID in the UK. And our panelists are Professor Pascal Fang, Director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence Research at HKUST in Hong Kong, Professor Mark Findlay, the Deputy Director of the Center for AI and Data Governance at SMU in Singapore, Steve Leonard, the CEO of Singularity University in Singapore, and last but not at least, Priyank Hirani, Consultant Asia Data and Tech Lead of the Rockefeller Foundation, one of our partners, and he's based in India. Now I'd like to hand over to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you very much, Christina, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are joining us from around the world. And before I get started, let me just say, for the record, the UN does not endorse any of the products or services advertised at the beginning of this session. So I'll just make that clear. I saw a few of the comments in the comment section. But let me start by giving some context, actually, and let me go back 5 years. So back in 2015, the world signed up to the most ambitious agenda, frankly, the world has ever signed up to, which were the Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals had three dimensions, if you like. There were economic goals, such as decent work for all. There were societal goals around healthcare for all. And of course, there were environmental goals related to climate change, etc. Another way of framing it is framing the goals around three categories of people, planet, and prosperity. And back then, technology was really heralded as kind of a key means of implementation to meet the ambitions of the SDGs. I mean, from an economic perspective, the hope that frontier technology such as AI could make businesses more productive. from a societal perspective, there were ambitions around how AI could provide healthcare diagnostics to people who had never had access to doctors. And from an environmental perspective, obviously there are ambitions around how kind of AI and smart cities could help us move towards kind of greener economies and societies. But if we fast forward now kind of 5 years to today, and with all the hype around the fourth industrial revolution, I think some of that positive energy has been kind of balanced out, shall we say. I mean, I think there are issues that we're all aware of, which are in the press all the time. Things like the future of work. Will AI take all people's jobs? Are there ethical considerations that could help us fall foul of AI for social good? And of course, this real threat of kind of the next arms race, and people, if you like, weaponizing AI in both traditional and next generation forms. So kind of that goes kind of to the question kind of why this agenda is really important and what's at stake. And I think without being overly dramatic, from a kind of utopian perspective, I mean, AI does have that potential to really drive a more thriving and productive economy, provide social services such as health and education to people who have never had access, and indeed move us, as I mentioned, towards greener and smarter societies and economies. I suppose on the dystopian side, and again, without being overly dramatic, there is potentially a danger that this could also lead to mass unemployment at a scale we've never seen. With the scalability of digital platforms, maybe kind of biases kind of accentuated at a scale and pace we've never seen. And of course, this weaponization of AI, which may or may not happen. So it's within this context that I really do believe public policy plays a critical role in one, directing AI towards social objectives or social good, and two, creating that enabling environment for AI for social good. And as Christina mentioned, this session is a summary of kind of two previous sessions that were focused on AI capability and infrastructure as well. And we've synthesized these insights into kind of 4 areas that you see on the screen here. That we'll be discussing today, and these are 4 areas that we think policymakers should really be aware of. And just to, I mean, you can read this off the screen yourselves, but just to very quickly summarize, there are 1, agile regulatory approaches; 2, negotiating different interest groups and ethical considerations; leveraging the private sector for social impact; and last but not least, technological know-how. And we'll be going into each of these in more detail. Before we kick off and I start kind of probing having a chat with the panel, let me just kind of remind you that for those who are joining us online, feel free to post your questions in the chat as and when they come up. And there'll be a Q&A at the end where we'll ask the panel to address some of the questions that come up. So please don't be shy, and please feel free to ask any questions, however complex or obvious they may seem. Let me get started now, and I'm particularly excited to get started because in my role as Chief of Technology Innovation at the UN for Asia Pacific, my role is to advise governments on technology innovation policy. And I often get asked the question, okay, we get AI is coming and it's going to be important. We need to channel AI for social good. Tell me what I should do. And I think that's a very difficult question to answer. So very selfishly, I'm hoping to glean some insights from the panelists here today. So without further ado, let me start with a discussion on and a chat around agile regulatory approaches. And let me first turn to Priyank first. From my own experiences, I used to work in venture capital, and I used to invest in technology startups, and I often thought regulation just got in our way. It stifled innovation. It killed everything we're trying to do. And then I went to work for the government, where I worked on tech regulation. I was like, no, we need to safeguard societal interests. You guys slow down a little bit. And I think it's a really interesting balance that you need to get for policymakers to not stifle innovation whilst also protecting and safeguarding societal interests. So my question to you, Priyank, is what are some of the kind of more practical and agile approaches governments could take to actually address this challenge of regulation and governance, particularly relating to AI? So Priyank, over to you first, and to the rest of the panelists, feel free to chime in if you have any comments thereafter. But maybe Priyank, I'll turn to you first.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jonathan, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. What you just mentioned is sort of hitting the nail right where it's needed. You're right, like there's the dual complexity of looking at the same problem from the technology company's point of view, as well as from a governance point of view. And it's interesting that because there's no governance mechanism, because we have not been able to develop that, sort of tech companies have been leading it, and they have been self-governing themselves, so to speak. But it's also a question about each of them doing its own thing, and then how do you then bring in a regulatory approach later, which could just be a disaster, right? So what is needed in terms of agile regulatory approaches, probably in my head, and this is something that also came up in the previous panel that I was part of as part of this series, where Professor Masaru spoke about the sandbox approach, right? So like looking at some regulatory sandboxes for policymakers at the city level, which is probably in the hierarchy, the lowest level of governance, where you're much teed up with the local governance mechanisms, right? So that is one approach that could be looked at, where there's a lot more participatory approach, so to speak, that is getting voices from the ground into this whole conversation. But an even more important thing in my head is where so far the world has been looking at regulatory approaches, the world has been looking at policymaking as a set of fixed rules. But I think with the advent of AI, we need to think about a set of desired outcomes, and then be flexible, be agile enough to keep changing as and when the need arises. Because what is going to happen is AI is quite unpredictable. As you rightly mentioned, it is no doubt that AI is going to sort of get into all parts of our lives. AI is going to be the new electricity, probably, where we will have to live with AI. But AI will also change the way we run our societies, the way our cultural aspects are taken into account. And the question then arises, sort of, what is important here, right? So are we building AI for communities, or are we building AI from within the communities? So are some communities left behind? Are we ensuring that AI is inclusive enough? Are we ensuring that AI does not create these biases? And it is less about the technology. It is more about our nature. We bring in our governance, what we see in society today, and put that as a layer on top of AI. So AI is, as the regulatory approaches that we talk about, is as much about technology as it is about human society. And that's where I think some of these approaches need to be taken into account. Yeah, so I'll stop there for my initial remarks.
Thank you very much. I particularly like this movement of regulation from fixed rules to desired outcomes. I think it'd be interesting to see how that would play out practically. But would any of the other panelists want to chime in on this one?
I think it's important to remember that the regulatory framework that attaches to AI is way behind the development of the tech, and has been for a very long time. And part of that has been exactly your argument, Jonathan, earlier on, that tech developers say that regulation impedes innovation. In many respects, that's a myth, because in so many other contexts, a well-regulated market will give much more flexibility to a good product and responsible product. But I think the issue is, for policymakers, a very significant challenge, not just to get regulation right, but to get regulation at all. And I think that we really need to sit down and think very carefully, in quite a sophisticated way, of what forms of regulation we want and why we want them.
Yes. Steve?
I think, harking back to the point that you'd made a moment ago, and I identify with it personally, also having been in tech and then having been in government in Singapore, governments seek to close gaps and loopholes, and VCs, as a general statement, seek to exploit loopholes, not in a negative sense, but that's where market opportunities arise, are gaps. And so those two are just naturally trying to find their coexistence together. I think as long as we look at consequences, that's where I think regulation ought to be considered. So health as a consequence, there's a high consequence. If we experiment in areas such as robotic surgery and how AI might inform, then I think there's a high consequence. Self-driving vehicles, there's a high consequence. There's other areas where you could say, is the consequence as high? It may be undesirable. I mean, to give credit to MAS in Singapore, where I spent a lot of time with some of the former teammates, there's a high degree of interest in being flexible and innovative with regulatory framework, because really the consequences, I think, could be much more manageable. If something doesn't happen as planned, lives may not be lost, maybe undesirable, but not lives. So I think the function of consequence is critical. But I think the key point that I hope we can also explore, Jonathan, is that we need an informed dialogue here. And I think this is part of what Mark is also referring to, that when people say, I don't want data used this way, or I do want more regulatory protection, I think we have to go further and say, okay, how should we imagine healthcare in the future if we have much more demand and we have constrained supply in terms of caregivers and resources? We must use tools such as AI in new ways in order to meet the needs of an aging population. So it's no good just sort of saying with the stroke of the pen, no. We have to find a way to continue pushing that dialogue forward. And I'm glad for today.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Pascal.
Yeah. Terms of regulation, Steve said it very well. I think it should be industry specific. For example, Steve outlined a very good direction for regulation in the health sector. And I think it is different also for the financial sector, and yet different again for autonomous weapon, where the conversation is taking place at the UN level, Geneva. So I think there are actually a lot of regulation in place already for specific industry, in the financial industry and health industry and so on. That's not to say that we don't need new regulation for AI, but I think regulation for AI should not be like a universal or the general rule. It should be industry and application specific, catering towards the need and the specific audience and the user of the AI technology. So as such, I think government regulatory bodies should be largely comprised of industry experts with maybe one or two AI experts to give advice. Our role should just be giving technical advice about what's possible and what's going to come and what we can do. In many cases, there are things that people worry about. Actually, I would advise that we don't need to worry about, because we're not going to be able to do that in terms of AI technology in our lifetime, for example. So I think if we have this well organized government regulatory bodies in different industry, with industry experts, as well as maybe one or two AI experts, then we should be able to have a more informed discussion and policy making. So currently, for example, I'm in the working group for the IEEE standards working group for AI governance. And this is a professional society. Just, there's ISO and there's IEEE. These are professional societies setting standards for the industry. And they basically regulate the application of AI. And there's a consensus that we cannot possibly regulate the research and development of AI technologies, because that will be interfering with academic independence and academic integrity. And it's also not possible to regulate that way. So I think it's not as complex as we think, and we should trust the industry experts. They know better what people need for each domain, and work with the AI specialists on that.
Great, thanks, Pascal. And let's move on to the next capability, and I'll touch upon what Steve mentioned earlier around this need for dialogue, and indeed this question of trust as well. And let me kind of point this next one towards Mark, which is negotiating interest groups and ethical considerations. Again, from my past, I started off my innovation journey working for the National Health Service in the UK, where I set up something called the National Innovation Centre, and my role was to get technology into the NHS to deliver better, faster, cheaper healthcare services. And very often the doctor would sit with me and say, Jonathan, I've been doing this 30 years now. What do you know that I don't? And I was much greener in those days. I didn't quite have the right answer. But Mark, let me turn to you on this one. I mean, how can we build trust in technology such as AI, especially with these specific interest groups? And towards Steve's point as well around this need for open dialogue, it's all well and good saying actually how can we incorporate diverse interests in policy making to ensure AI does accelerate towards social good. But how could policymakers go about doing this, and what are the tools and techniques they could use to move towards more open forms of policymaking, which is evident that many people are saying that's needed to ensure AI evolves in the right way. So maybe Mark, over to you for some insights.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think the issue that we can't also forget when we're talking about capabilities is, and talking about the interest of different stakeholders, is not just the diversity of industrial need or the diversity of technological impetus, but also the diversity of social context. And so in many situations, particularly across the Asian region, with low to middle income countries, their development technologically, their development in terms of the basic foundations of social life is nothing like you'd find in Tokyo or Singapore or Seoul or Hong Kong. And therefore, to simply imagine that it's the same situation for stakeholders there is really naive and most probably misdirected. The other thing that I would raise is that a lot of the technological impetus for taking up AI is coming from big tech companies outside this region. It's coming from the North World, as it's loosely called, and obviously there are sensible reasons for that. And if you sit down with people that operate in very big MNCs and talk to them about the cultural location, the sort of human capacity issues, human capital issues that relate to what are the ground level social needs, they're often unaware of these issues and unaware about how to address them. And this is, I suppose, where the politicians come in, because to some extent they are the meat in the sandwich. They obviously want the development of technology to move their economies forward, but at the same time they're aware of the fact that each economic context is profoundly different. So that if we were looking at the enhancement of the provision of health services through technology, then in a place like Singapore, we might be talking about sophisticated robotics in relation to surgery. In India, we might be just talking about, getting basic medical testing into rural areas. And so the nature of the technological need and the capacity that we're searching for is somewhat different. The other point I was going to pick up is something which was said a little earlier, and that is the idea of looking at what people actually think, what's at the basis of their concept of need. And so going back to questions of understanding the social context in which certain things arise and certain things are developed. There's work going on now, certainly in those countries that are not entirely satisfied with ethics as the ultimate regulator, looking at something called digital self-determination, which is the concept that individuals who are impacted by technology will have some say in the way in which that technology influences their life. And I think the concept of digital self-determination is a very interesting one when you're looking at different stakeholder groups. But I would say something that arose really significantly from our group earlier in one of the sessions was about power differentials. That in society, some people have power to choose. In other sections of that society, people have no power to choose. And so, again, simply having a one-size-fits-all idea that people will be able to assert their rights in relation to technology and the use of technology is again naive. The final thing I'd say is that I wouldn't like us, whether we're talking about regulation or whether we're talking about capacity building and capability, to forget the fact that AI depends on data, and data depends on data subjects. And the majority of data subjects are human somewhere. And so the question about whether we open up access to data, whether we have a freer flow of data for the benefit of technological development, there are great pluses and there are some challenges associated with that. But I think it's important to remember that we can't keep data subjects in the dark, if you like, because they are ultimately the foundation of the data that AI depends on and that AI uses.
Thank you. And apologies for kind of asking you such a philosophical question at this time in the morning, but this question around actually how you build trust. Again, as a tech and innovation policymaker, when I was back in the UK, it was never on my agenda, and nor did I have the skills. I mean, how would a policymaker, how do you kind of develop policy to actually build trust in these sorts of things? And are you seeing any kind of practical examples of things that policymakers are doing or anywhere in Asia or indeed around the world?
Well, could I suggest that trust isn't something that you simply require people to give you? It's something that you earn. And so in many respects, the idea of a sort of paternalistic approach to the population, saying to people, well, look, just trust me because I know what's better for you, is really not going to go that far. I mean, I've sat down with tech scientists and tech developers who say, look, how am I ever going to explain algorithms to the common person? They're never going to understand this. And my reply to that is, well, they may not understand the science, but they understand the outcomes. And so in that respect, I think that there's a very strong argument to say that trust is if we believe trust is worthwhile, and to be honest, you know, we may not necessarily trust our washing machine or trust our refrigerator or whatever, although I suppose in some circumstances we do, but we're very keen to develop this idea of the relationship between the human and the robot, the human and the tech. Now, if that's dependent on trust, then trust has to be based on something. And it's not just simply based on power, and it's not just simply based, in my experience, on the government or a big tech company saying, we know what's best for you. And I'll conclude on this point. The situation with resistance to tracing and tracking tech as a consequence of COVID is very clear in this respect, that the tracing and tracking tech depends on take-up, and take-up depends on trust. Now, trust can be shattered by ignorance, it can be shattered by misinformation, but very often it's shattered by no information. And so I've got quite a strong argument that even, you know, the simplest citizen is in a situation where they're better positioned to trust something if they are engaged with it, and if they have some sense of what its purpose is, and finally, if they believe that its purpose has some benefit for them, not just simply for the person who's selling the tech.
Cheers, Mark.
I will.
Sorry, I'm just very mindful of the time, but we'll come back to this in the Q&A when we have time. But I just want to move on to Steve very quickly. On this importance of leveraging the private sector for social good. I mean, I think particularly in Asia, where we sit, I mean, it's evident that the tech giants are kind of driving AI's evolution, and I think you're very well placed to answer this, given that in your previous role you often had one foot in government, one foot in the private sector, and depending on your mood or the question I asked you, you claim to be in the government or the private sector, which was a nice decision to be in. But I mean, there's a broader question around how we can, if you like, incentivize, or how can government policy incentivize private sector AI evolution towards kind of doing good, if you like, as well as doing well. And a second question I want to ask you as well is relating to government policy on this. Is this whole notion of supply side policy versus demand side policy? And again, having worked in policy previously, whatever the question was, the answer was always, let's set up an innovation fund, let's build a science park. You know, very much supply side measures. But what sort of demand side measures are you seeing that could be both relevant and practical for policymakers to implement for AI's evolution? So I know two big questions, but over to you, Steve.
All right, let me try and keep them in my mind, and if I fail on one, you'll call me out. But in a nutshell, I think it's and it's not derogatory, I think it's just obvious that as a general statement, government always has the ability to move certain levers more easily, and therefore making funds available, establishing research entities, you know, doing things that are doable, which is not wrong, but those are relatively more straightforward. This next step then intersects with the conversation we had moments ago about regulation. And my particular advice, if that's the word I'm looking for, to my colleagues when I was in Singapore government was, let's not think about launching more grand challenges or more opportunity-based get-togethers, but instead for those entrepreneurs that are working to create something new and different, we have to give them a chance. And so we had already invested in and seen the genesis of several dozen healthcare and AI-related entities seeking to improve speed of diagnostics, seeking to improve certain treatments. And we thought that those were complementary. And in fact, we had a number of physicians and caregivers that were involved in those startups. The challenge was that required a different mindset around the regulatory approach, which is, okay, do we need these to have all of these different burdens of regulatory approval in the same way that something might? And again, we wouldn't say let's experiment with medical robotics. There would be something much lower consequence. But I think the point here, Jonathan, is if government wants to create an ecosystem in which these sorts of private sector engagements are viable, you're left with two choices. Either you go to the big established players and you say to IBM or Google or Microsoft, what do you have? Or you go to the entrepreneurial community and say, what can you help us solve? And I was always an advocate for the entrepreneurial community because I think there's always something exciting there and always something economically additive there, since all economies are built on entrepreneurship at some level. The challenge was somebody coming forward and saying, I can improve stroke diagnostics if I use hemodynamics and computer vision in this combination. And here's the 15 neuroscientists that have added to that research work, which is now a prototype. We couldn't find people that would be willing to give us a chance in Singapore. So they went to Australia. And they now have half a dozen hospitals in which they are working meaningfully with physicians there that are experimenting. And again, it's very open prototype. The thing that I would give credit for is there was a mindset of, let's see how it goes. Now it's a little bit of the not born here, and so therefore it must be interesting. So because it was born in Singapore, we had a problem adopting it. If it had been born in Australia, perhaps we would have said, hey, let's give it a try. The Australians were happy to experiment with it. And now, interestingly, it's labeled an Australian startup, even though it was born in Singapore. The reason I'm saying that is government can create the conditions that, in addition to the hundreds of millions of dollars of funding around research, in addition to the grant and calls for collaboration, all of those I think are useful. It's not to diminish those. But if we don't then say, here's the companies that were spawned by and formed through those processes, let's find some way, minor as it might be, to try and involve them in some of this experimentation, then I think it leads to a relatively unsatisfying conclusion. So my goal on this would be that government becomes the great collaborator as opposed to the great funder. And I think there's something much more around iteration that government might choose to be a part of. So let me stop there in case I've failed to answer any other questions.
No. You've answered both at the same time. So thank you very much for that. But I just want to probe a bit further. I mean, you mentioned kind of looking to kind of entrepreneurs and startups asking, what can you do to help us to solve these challenges versus the bigger companies around what have you got? I mean, yeah. that seems like also the tougher nut to crack as well, right? I mean, have you ever seen any policies around how we can move them 2 degrees more towards social good, shall we say, in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that has to do with healthcare is by its nature social good. I mean, I'll just sort of broad brush that. I'm sure there's lots of ways to debate it. But the idea would be, if you want to think about assisting nurses and frontline workers, there's different ways to do that. If you want to think about assisting radiologists and neurologists, there's ways to do that. We actually didn't go out at any point and say, here's a problem we're trying to solve. Does anyone know how to solve it? We never did that, or at least my team never did that. What we did is we found amazing people that were involved in research that were almost always at the moment of completing their PhD, perhaps had been 1 or 2 years postdoc, and had said, you know, I think what I'm working on has broader application and I'd like to see if there's some way of bringing it forward, but I don't know how to do that. And the reason that we created the team that I used to be with was purely to serve the entrepreneurial scientist at that moment of transition from a research adventure into a potential commercial adventure. What we did not do well, so we built off government's massive investments in research and AI and education. What we did not do well was succeed in persuading enough of our government colleagues to say, you know what, let's give this a try. And the way I explained it to founders was governments are hired, I mean, to use a euphemism, governments are hired, elected to keep people safe. They're not paid to be on the cutting edge of the craziest experimentation in case it may or may not work. But the only thing I would observe in this closing statement is citizens want governments to anticipate and resolve problems before they become big problems. So no one is satisfied if we say, keep autonomous vehicles off the road because they may or may not work in all cases. Well, human drivers don't work in all cases. But if we say, let's wait until autonomous vehicles are optimized and perfected, and then we'll put them on the road, that would be the regulator first view. As soon as we can't move anywhere because traffic is at a standstill because everyone has a private car, people say, who didn't think about autonomous or shared vehicle? We should have anticipated this. So there's this natural tension of needing to always be thinking about those things, Jonathan, and that's what we need citizens to accept. There has to be some level of experimentation in order to be ready for the problems that are inevitably 3 or 5 years down the road. They're not far. 3 or 5 years down the road, we'll be in various forms of housing crisis, health crisis. We have to work on it now, right now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Steve. Now let's move on to Pascal and touching on the capability around technical know-how. I mean, how can governments actually build technological know-how? I mean, having been a civil servant now and indeed in the past, these ain't the sort of skills you usually have in a government. So I know, how do you build these skills? And actually, particularly, how do you build these skills if you're in a developing country, of which there are many in Asia. I think Singapore, Japan, Korea, China are kind of the exceptions to the rule in terms of technological evolution and development. But interested in your thoughts on that question, Pascal.
Yes. So before I answer that question, I want to speak a little bit about the issue of trust, because I wanted to say something earlier. I think people should remember, like we have organizations such as the FDA, the Federal Drugs Administration, to approve drugs, right? So I go to my doctor and I get some prescription drugs. I have no idea how those drugs work. And I'm not going to study the chemistry. I mean, I'm not capable of understanding how it works. But I trust my doctor who is certified. And also I trust FDA approved drug that I can use. And today we have medical equipment and all that, electronic equipment. They also need to be approved by the FDA. So I'm saying that trust can be built also this way, where we have this something similar to the FDA. Actually, in health sector, probably the FDA should do the job of approving AI enabled equipment and so on. So this is what I want to raise as a point of view. Now, coming back to your question about developing countries' government, I think the most important thing for building any technological innovation, let alone AI, is to attract talents. I think today we have many of our Asian students going overseas to the AI superpower countries to study and with the know-how. And the key is for the government to attract these talents back home. We've seen this successfully done with previously with previous generations of researchers to Taiwan, to South Korea in recent decades, and most recently to mainland China. So these governments are able to attract talents back because of the talents perceive that they have a fair chance of being successful there, that they have there are a lot of government policies of to attract talent scheme, particular science parks, all those things, and a vibrant entrepreneurial environment at the capital market where they can get investment and so on. And they've seen success cases. So it is important for the, governments to provide the environment in which talents can thrive, and it should be merit-based. There should not be any nepotism, and there shouldn't be. It should be a clean environment without corruption. So I think that's the most important part that the government can do.
Great, thank you very much. And does anyone else want to chime in on this issue of digital skills? I mean, it's interesting. Oh, sorry, technical know-how. it strikes me that it's only kind of, again, that technical understanding of AI is just one part of the whole puzzle. I mean, do we need more moral philosophers in government? Do we need people more human-centered design? I suppose the question in my mind is, what does a next generation policymaker look like in the context of AI? And are there any interesting examples that maybe some of the other panelists have seen around governments trying to bring a different skill set into this to ensure that AI is kind of directed towards social good? But Priyank.
Yeah, if I could. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. If I could chime in. So the way I see it is, taking from Pascal's point, there's not just a need for having this digital capabilities and developing this talent pool for AI, but also developing capabilities within governments. So ensuring that policymakers start speaking the same language, start understanding what people are talking about, and are sort of not left behind, right? So this is also something that both Mark and Steve alluded to, where technology is probably moving much faster than governments. So looking at how can we have governments be ahead of the curve, and as part of that, something that we are doing at the Rockefeller Foundation is working with UNDP's Regional Innovation Center, and then through the Next Gen Gov platform, we're saying how can we have the next generation of policymakers sort of look at more technologically advanced approach, can also look at a public-private partnership with the government and involve all stakeholders to not be left behind in sort of the AI development. And then looking at the integrated future for human and digital, which is something that the AI +1 report that Rockefeller Foundation launched earlier this year was talking about. So just taking both of these things, I feel like will set us up for the future policymakers.
Thank you, Priyank. Steve, I see you're off mute. Do you want to chime in here?
No, I'm good. I mean,
okay.
Briefly, I think a couple of quick points. One is, I think we just have to continue to communicate. I think government has to continue to communicate openly about the trade-offs, as it were. I think this is, I'm an advocate, so I'm biased, which is, I think Singapore has done a good job communicating why there are restrictions like this or that as part of managing COVID, right? You get PM on, you get other ministers on, and they say, look, it's no fun, but forget about travel, forget about this and that, right? We just have to get this thing under control. And thankfully, it's been brought down to a much lower level. But everybody said, okay, kind of get that. If we were to say, hey, we know that we have to be able to provide more AI-assisted healthcare in order to serve you, since the population will be average age 65 and beyond in the next 15, 18 years in Singapore, we know that this is something we have to do. So here's some things we're doing about it. Right? We're not going to lurch into it headlong. We're going to experiment, but we want you to know that. I think these things brought forward in a thoughtful way with the idea that if we don't, you're going to spend 5 hours in a waiting room. If we do, you'll spend 20 minutes in a waiting room, is something that everybody, without needing to understand all of the explainability of the models, will say, I generally understand that. So communication in government on a very, it's okay to experiment way. And then the second point is this humanist concept. We prioritize very highly PhDs in arcane levels of science, right? If you have a PhD in combinatorics, then that's amazing. And if you were to say, I have a social sciences perspective, people say, we need hard sciences. It's actually that intersection that you're highlighting, which is, how will I use this? How will I live with this? How will this affect my family and me? Which I think is so important, and why some technology companies have been able to be so good at that social and technology interface. So I think that's an area that government could always choose to consider. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. I'm a terrible moderator, so I've gone a bit over time. But I see a very rich discussion on the chat, and thank you for some of the back office team, if you like, for answering some of those questions. But Mark, there's one actually really interesting question that's come through that I want to put to you in the first instance. And it's relating to actually how do you go about auditing an AI? Yeah, I'm reading out here, so that we know it follows what's legal and ethical. How would you practically do that? So please get your thoughts on that, Mark.
Well, it's the same issue as any question of auditing, whether it's AI or not. that when you talk about auditing, particularly in areas of elite knowledge, the individuals who have the elite knowledge turn around and say, well, we're the only ones who understand this, therefore you can't audit us. And in many respects, that's a misunderstanding of what the audit process is. The audit process may not be about the integrity of the science, it may be about the consequences of the science. And it may also be about much simpler things like the way in which the outcome of the scientific pipeline produces a particular expectation in society, in the community, in politics, in economics. So if you look, for example, at a lot of the compliance auditing that goes on in the financial sector, it's not so much about whether the banks were acting in a way which was exactly within their charter, but rather whether the product of their financial services was something that was risky, unreasonably so, or whatever it might be. Now, there's a big debate going on at the moment about algorithmic auditing, and I think that part of that is based on an issue that I'd question, in fact, by those who argue that trust is generated through people believing professionals and people believing in specialist knowledge, because there is a great shift, and I think it's a very unfortunate shift, away from belief in science, away from belief in technology, and away from belief in politicians. I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I couldn't think of a profession that is less believed and less trusted than lawyers. And partly that's due because I think of misperceptions about what we do and what we stand for. And I think I would say, look, if auditing is possible, let's not argue about the fact that, oh, it's too complicated, but let's facilitate it. You know, if you are in a position where you are open to be audited, the reputational value of that is a plus. I'll conclude on this, that accountability is a dangerous thing. Usually what happens in the first phase of accountability is that it shows up problems in the issue that's being looked at, examined, interrogated. That's the short term. In the medium term, it corrects those challenges, those problems, and reputation benefits from it. So I'm a great believer in the possibility of auditing, provided that we don't simply believe that the audit is the only thing that's the measure that we should go by.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you very much. Another question that's come in, and I'll ask this one because the panelists are predominantly from academia. So the question is, a lot of college students are at the forefront of AI experimentation today, but don't have the connections to communicate with the government and policymakers. What are some of the ways in which they can influence government policy so that their voices are better heard? Anybody? I'll open it up to.
What do you mean by college students?
I don't know. I just asked the question as it was in the chat. Interpret it as you see fit.
Well, college students are the most free type of free agents. They can go talk to any professors, any government agencies, and just cold call anybody. They just can talk to their professors. We're always open to discussions with our students. We have various forums for them to express their views. Students can organize, students can lead forum discussions if they want. They can certainly, organize debates and invite experts, and with the professor's help to invite experts and so on. So college students can always take initiative to make their voices heard.
Thank you. Anybody else on that one?
Just to say that one of the problems with the integrity of academic-based research has been a bit like something Steve said in our earlier session, and that is that we've hyped the capacity of our research, like AI is often overhyped as well. Universities have made a rod for their own back, in my experience, not all universities, but some, by saying that they could do too much when in fact they couldn't. And I think what would be much more positive for re-establishing a trust and faith in university-based research is not simply to always make it applied, but also to make it, I think, much more realistic and much more contained within the problems that we can best address.
In our defense, I don't think any university has made any hype, unless it would be considered unethical to overclaim anything. Everything all the research output are in terms of peer-reviewed journals and conference papers, and they are very rigorously reviewed. So what I've seen in hype in the media often comes not from the universities themselves at all. They're often coming from people who are not related to the research. In fact, all research in AI, they are open in the public domain. You can search using Google Scholar. You can find them. The problem is not that. The problem is the lack of scientific method training in the general public. Why do people not trust science? Because today, it's not true for all parts of the world. In China, people have still this trust in experts and scientists and technologists. I would say in certain parts of the world, this aversion to experts' opinion and all that comes from, I would say, populism, and it's political, it's ignorance, it's a social media magnification of this kind of ignorance. It's misinformation, it's fake news and all that. So what we need to do is to actually regulate fake news, regulate misinformation, and not use this kind of misinformation to regulate AI. This is the backwards thing. So I think it's very important today to provide, to encourage the general public, or have some kind of education reform where people get more scientific training, including the government officials. It's clear to me that different governments, for example, I wouldn't name names, certain governments have civil servants who are more, let's say, who were trained scientifically, and it makes a difference in their decisions. I would say my own government in Hong Kong, there are a lot of people in my government who are who are not trained scientifically, and it's very hard for them to understand anything in terms of scientific or technology innovation. I think this is the reason in Hong Kong we are not developing technically to the full potential that we have. We have top universities, top research output here, but the transfer to the technology transfer has been lagging because our government is really not very suitable. They are basically people who have not had scientific training. So that's the issue, in my view. It's not university hyping anything.
I'm very mindful of the time. And I often am on panels and I hate it when people ask me this question. So I'm going to ask you it now. When they say, tell me in one word, is the question. Maybe I'll give you 2 or 3 words. But there are, as you know, that there are policymakers from across the region in the room. What from your perspective, would be the one policymaking capability you think is most important to direct AI for social good? And I'll give you 1 to 3 words, and I will ruthlessly cut you off because we have about a minute left. So maybe Priyank first, because you're on the screen.
I would say innovating AI governance.
Thank you.
I'm restricted in 3 words.
I'll give you 3. Steve.
Creating conducive conditions.
Thank you. Pascal.
Steve used my words, I guess. I would say
Perfect.
to be educated in truth versus in science versus misinformation.
Thank you.
And make
and
your
Mark.
policies accordingly.
And Mark, last but not least.
Something that Priyak said earlier, and that was a clarity of purpose. And I think if we have a clarity of purpose, whatever the purpose is for developing AI, then we've got a debate. If the purpose is profit, fine, we can have that debate. If it's social good, we can have that debate. If it's whatever it is, I think it's clarity of purpose.
Great, thank you so much. And that draws the panel to a close. A very rich conversation with all of you, and thank you as always. It's good to reconnect with some of you I've not seen in a while as well, and a very rich discussion on the chat. I couldn't even dream of trying to summarize all of that, but fortunately it's not my job. So I will pass over to Christina to close us out for this session. Christina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you to Pascal, to Mark and Steve for sharing your insights and for this very important and lively discussion. And also, I would like to thank all of the participants who joined the session today and who engaged in the chat. I don't know if you watched it, but it was very lively. And your input actively shapes this important discussion. Now, for participants in this session and all our speakers, we'll be sharing a policy insight briefing that summarizes key points the 3 discussions that we've had on enabling environments. It's a discussion today, and the 2 previous ones on infrastructure and capabilities that we ran last week. So if you're interested in getting in touch with one of the experts on the panels, then please feel free to email me. There should be an email address, I think, on the, yes, here in the get in touch slide that you see on the screen now. So please feel free to email if you want to get in touch with any of the colleagues. Also, we gratefully help you to share this outputs of the chat on social media. The social media handles are also on the slides. Please feel free to share everything. So I mentioned earlier that today's session is part of the broader AI for Social Good series. Now join us for our next sessions on November 17 for the discussion on multi-stakeholder governance on core regulations. And you see the schedule there on the screen. And for the multi-stakeholder governance and co-regulation session, we have exciting speakers such as David Hardoon, Senior Advisor on Data and AI at the Union Bank in the Philippines. We have Kanchana Vanchikun, she's a Vice President from the Office of National Higher Education, Science Research and Innovation Policy Council in Thailand. And we have got Puneet Sukla, Project Lead on AI and Machine Learning from the World Economic Forum, and others. So these are not all the speakers, we've got many more. So please join us. And we are looking forward to having you as part of those sessions and to continue the discussion. But in the meantime, we're wishing you all a wonderful and restful day wherever you are. So thank you very much to all of you again.